bastion of Ypres marked a defiant line in the defence of Belgium, but behind the lines was the route to the front, the place where the soldiers who were wounded were treated and where the supplies came up to feed the war, to feed the front. We travel behind the lines at Ypres. I've just returned from a few weeks up and down parts of the old front line. In my work as a battlefield guide, I've been fortunate to walk the battlefields with a group and take several groups on introductory tours to the Western Front. While I was out there, we had a fantastic live stream from the Men in Gate for our Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee supporters, and broadcasting live via Zoom for those supporters from the Men in Gate was a new venture for the podcast, and one I certainly hope to repeat. You can support the podcast at any time by listening to it, and I'm forever grateful for the thousands of you now that listen to it on every episode. The listening figures seem to rise and rise. But if you want to support it more directly, you can go to our Patreon page and our Buy Me a Coffee page. Links to those are on the podcast website, oldfrontline.co.uk. I also bumped into quite a few podcast listeners when I was out on the battlefields, and again, that's a really, really nice thing to do, to meet some of you, to hear what you think, to hear what episodes have particularly affected you in different ways. And I certainly hope over the coming months, as I'm back out there again, I'll see some more of you as we travel around those battlefields. But while I was in Ypres over the last few weeks, I thought about not the front line so much, because on every tour that I do, I always try to set the scene for a group and give them an introduction to what they're going to be looking at over the course of their tour. And while we're going to be visiting the front lines on these tours, it's important to understand the process of getting to those front lines and what kept those front lines supplied. And it made me think about the behind the lines in Flanders, really, the behind the lines at Ypres. And that's what this podcast is going to be about. So we're going to pack our virtual boots, head out onto the ground with our virtual pack, and look at behind the lines at Ypres. We've looked at different aspects of behind the lines on the Western Front in quite a few podcasts now, and it is an important part of our understanding. And there is a lot to find in the areas behind the front. Areas unaffected largely by shell fire in most cases. There's much more original buildings to go and discover, for example. And in this episode we'll look at the behind the lines in Flanders for the British Army holding the line around Ypres, the approaches to their front and the important towns connected to the supply of that front, and also the experience of the soldiers when they were out of the line. Where did they come to when they were out of the trenches in the battlefields around Ypres? And although this is in Flanders, when you look at a map of Belgium in the First World War, you'll see that most of Belgium was overrun by the German army very early in the war, and only a tiny pocket of Belgium, a bit of Flanders, was left. So perhaps it's not a surprise that a big chunk of this route that we're going to take is actually not in Belgium at all. It begins, and for a chunk of it, it's in France. And what we've got with this podcast really is, in some respects, a tale of three towns: Hazebrouck, Balliol and Popperinge. And for the soldiers who served on the Flanders front during the Great War, those were the three key towns that they knew in arriving at the front, in departing from the front, or if they were wounded or sick somewhere on the battlefield, the route by which they were evacuated from that frontline area. As usual, there'll be a map for this podcast on the podcast website, and we're starting in Hazebrouck. Hazebrouck is a town in northern France, in French Flanders. The region of Flanders itself is an old name for a much bigger area covering what is today two separate countries. It has a long and checkered history, and this was once part of the Spanish Netherlands, for example. But Hazebrouck today is in France, and Hazebrouck in 1914 was in France as well. And we're starting at the railway station in Hazebrouck. Now, this town was behind the lines for most of the Great War. In 1918 it was very heavily bombarded, and again in the Second World War, Hazebrouck, en route to the Channel coasts, the advance of the German Blitzkrieg, the German forces in 1914, and the withdrawal of the British and French forces from northern France up to the coast around Dunkirk, saw Hazebrouck once more in the path of war, and it was damaged again. And the railway station here was also very heavily bombed in the Second World War, because in this area of northern France there were a lot of V1 Doodlebug sites, and Hazebrouck was an area where the missiles were brought into for distribution to those different sites. So it was very heavily bombed by the RAF and the American Air Force. But coming back to its Great War history, in 1914, as early as 1914, as the British troops moved up from the Marne and the Aisne in that early phase of the war, when they were withdrawn from Mons down to the Marne, fought in the Battle of the Marne, the Germans had been pushed back to the Aisne heights. Both sides had dug in, the first trenches were there, and then the Germans moved their attention to northern France in the so-called race to the sea. And British troops moved up into northern France and up into Flanders to slow down, alongside their Belgian and their French allies, that phase of the German advance. And the railways, A.J.P. Taylor referred to that early period of the war as war by timetable, with reference to the importance of railways in the Great War, and railways were used by the British Army from the very beginning to move troops around. And Hazebrouck sat, most importantly, at a main railway junction. The routes from Hazebrouck could take you to almost any part of central and northern France, and in terms of what became the Western Front, that was greatly important, because it meant that troops could be brought from the coast or from the base depot, as it was in the early phase of the war at Rouen, up to Hazebrouck, and then sent off to the main British front as it was then in Flanders, or across to the area around Armentières down to La Bassée. And then later in the war, routes could be taken down to Arras and down to Amiens and Albert in the Somme sector. So it sat at this important railway juncture, and that's why we're here at the station, because during the Great War probably millions of British and Commonwealth soldiers passed through here at some particular point, either going up to the front, coming away from the front, or being sent down to another sector. Leave trains went through here to take men back to Boulogne, for example, to go across on the leave boats to Folkestone to get home to see their family, and reinforcement drafts coming from the base depot at Rouen up to 1916, and then Etaples from the end of the Battle of the Somme onwards until the end of the war itself. Men having been sent over, trained up at the base depot at Etaples, would then be sent up to the front line, and they'd all come through Hazebrouck one way and another. So when we stand at the railway station here today, an echo of its former self in terms of the 1914 world, I do think of the men who would have passed through here and who would have seen the name Hazebrouck on a railway signboard, and seen perhaps for the first time where they were in this part of France, and knew that the front was ever close, because in the distance, Hazebrouck only being tens of miles from the front, they could hear the rumble of the guns in the distance. The town of Hazebrouck in 1914 had a population of about 10,000, so it was a sizable town. German forces had entered Hazebrouck in October 1914, when it was said that the mayor of Hazebrouck sat in the main square in an armchair surrounded by French territorial soldiers, and realising that if he put up resistance the town could be sacked and destroyed and burnt to the ground, he offered the surrender. But the Germans were only there briefly. They pulled back as the British armies moved north, and the town sat behind the front line. It would sit behind the front line for much of the rest of the war. And when the British came to map the fronts from 1915 onwards, they went to war with War Office maps that were based on local European data, which proved to be highly inaccurate. So the maps were created showing different parts of the front. There was a sheet issued, and you see this in many war diaries of the period, Hazebrouck 5A, and that map, for many men who came here, particularly officers, was a poignant connection to this town, to this route, to this way up to the battlefields. You could describe Hazebrouck for most of the war as something like a frontier town. It was a place where there was a lot of soldiers, a lot of military activity, the streets would have been full of khaki and full of other uniforms of other nations who had come to take part in the Great War. The French civilian population lived here for most of the war. A lot left in 1918 when the fighting got very close. But it was a rough, tough town in many respects, a place that soldiers didn't spend a lot of time, a place that they were passing through, and I think that reflected the nature of the relationship that they had with it while they were here. It was a leave town, as we mentioned. The leave trains came through here and took men back to the coast to head back home, and sometimes there would be a bit of a gap between the arrival of that train and the movement of the train up to the coast itself, and that's when soldiers would be given the opportunity to jump off and go into the town to go and have a drink or go and have a walk around. And in the area around the railway station, when you read the accounts of men who were here, there were an awful lot of bars and estaminets to cater for these troops. The local population saw a business opportunity, and who can blame them under the circumstances? And for a big chunk of the conflict, it felt as if the war was far away. In fact, it was only 15 to 20 miles to the nearest point where the front line was located. But in April 1918, when the Germans along the Western Front in that spring launched a whole series of offensives, the Battle of the Lys, as the British called it, brought the German army to the very gates of Hazebrouck. They were stopped just down the road at the Ypres forest, but the town came under considerable damage then. Prior to that, it had been bombed by aircraft, long-range shells had dropped on the town, but in 1918, even field guns could fire into Hazebrouck, and a lot of the buildings were damaged or destroyed, which is why we see quite a mixture of architecture in the town. It was officially part of the Red Zone, that Zone Rouge, that classified areas in terms of their level of destruction after the First World War, and there was a lot of rebuilding in the 1920s. Again, you see that reflected in the buildings in the town. But aside from being a transit town to get men to and from the front, it was also a route in which the wounded and the sick were brought back from the battlefields, and certainly in that early phase of the war, with the front line in Flanders, men wounded around Ypres were brought back through the evacuation system and were treated in casualty clearing stations around Hazebrouck. So it's not a surprise to find, as we've said many times on this podcast, wherever you have a medical post of any description, you will always have graves because men die of their wounds. And at Hazebrouck there is a communal cemetery, quite a large plot of British and Commonwealth graves from the First World War, reflecting the casualty clearing stations that were here, and also later in the conflict, number 9 Red Cross Hospital was established in Hazebrouck, upping the level of medical facilities that were here. The cemetery was started in October 1914 when the fighting close to Hazebrouck, as the British Army moved up to counter that thrust to the coast by the Germans, casualties from that fighting were brought back here for burial and men died of their wounds here, and the cemetery remained open until July of 1918. There are 718 British burials, 59 Canadian, 50 Australian, 30 New Zealand, 7 Indian, 2 men of the Chinese Labour Corps, 1 soldier of the British West Indies Regiment, and 11 whose unit is unknown. We mentioned that the fighting in the Second World War swept through here, so there's a plot of 86 British burials, largely from the fighting in May 1940, and the cemetery itself originally was designed by Sir Herbert Baker, one of the principal architects of the Imperial War Graves Commission. Unusually, perhaps uniquely, I've certainly never come across another example of it, the town contributed towards Baker's design financially. They gave 20,000 old French francs. Now this was not an inconsiderable sum for that period. It equates to a relatively modest amount of money now, but I think it shows how some communities were so affected and felt so part of the dead that were buried on their soil, and it's important to remember this, I think. While the very earliest burials here are from those 1914 battles, as you scan the dates and you come to the winter of 1914-15, you see more and more men who have been wounded at Ypres and brought back here for treatment and died of their wounds. And when the Second Battle of Ypres began in April and the fighting continued on into May of 1915, that is a period of the war which dominates a big chunk of some of the plots in this cemetery. Among the burials, and this was a grave that took my eye the very first time I came to Hazebrouck way back in the 1980s, among those burials from the Second Battle of Ypres is Private Edward Rust of the 1st 4th Battalion of the Yorkshire Regiment, the Greenhowards. He died of wounds on the 30th of April 1915, aged 19. The 1st 4th Yorkshire Regiment was a territorial battalion, and they were part of the 50th Northumbrian Division that had only just arrived in France. They'd arrived, assembled in the grounds behind the front, and then been sent straight up into the Second Battle of Ypres, marched up the road to beyond St. Julien, northeast of Ypres. The vast majority of them having never been anywhere near the trenches, let alone into a battle, and their casualties during that operation were very high indeed. A previous episode of the podcast, we visited that area around Wiltshire, where the divisional memorial is located and where they went into action during that phase of the war. Edward Russ was born in Gateshead and he was educated at a grammar school. His father was a vicar, a parish priest of St John's Church in Ham Street, and he placed a stained glass window in his church in memorial to him. The church is still there, but it's now a private home from what I can discover, and it's one that I've never had a chance to go into. So if that's local to you and you're able to get there and photograph that stained glass window and see what other memorials there might be to Private Edward Rust, I'd certainly be very interested to know. What attracted me to Rust's grave was not so much the information about his father or the period of the war in which he died or his regiment, but what, when you see his grave, is most apparent is the inscription. Now, we know from a previous podcast episode where we looked at inscriptions in the Great War, we know that they were restricted to a certain number of characters, 66 in fact, including spaces. But this headstone is entirely covered in text. It's not entirely unique. There are a few others very similar to this, but it's probably one of the lengthiest inscriptions on any headstone anywhere on the Western Front battlefields. And one wonders how Edward Rust's father managed to get permission to include this inscription, but he did, and here it is. And this is what is engraved on his grave. Seriously wounded while advancing with his regiment in the fighting near St. Julien, Saturday, April the 24th, 1915. He was taken to the field hospital, but was so eager to uphold the honour of his regiment and to serve his country that he returned next day to the firing line and remained with his comrades until they were relieved, and died on April the 30th, courageous to the end and beloved by all who knew him. I think the language of these inscriptions is fascinating, and it's not just the length, it's what they say and what's in them, and the words that are used to describe and come to terms in many respects with the loss of the person whose grave this is. And it's something that we've looked at in terms of what the inscriptions are, but I'm sure it's a subject we'll return to again in the future. As this is in many ways an Ypres cemetery because the men buried here had come back from the Ypres front, once we move beyond that mid-1915 period, we come into the 2-year stretch of static trench warfare around Ypres. So what we're seeing here is the graves of men not killed in great battles of the First World War, but in the day-to-day activities of trench warfare, of sniping, of machine gun fire, of gas attacks, of trench raids, of tunnelling operations where mines are blown underneath the trenches, night patrols, and all of the other experiences that make up what trench warfare was at that time. The April 1918 plots reflect the fighting just outside of the town when Australian forces, men of the Australian Imperial Force, moved up and fought alongside British units in the defence of the ground around the Ypres forest during that Battle of the Lys. And there are quite a few diggers buried here, many of them Gallipoli veterans, some who were killed 3 years after they'd first set foot on the Gallipoli Peninsula on the original Anzac Day. Having looked at Hazebrouck, we'll leave the town now and roughly go east, north of the railway line, and follow a route through a number of small northern French villages which have quite a Flemish feel about them, places that were billets for the troops behind the lines, and the roads that we'll take were main routes up towards the front. And these roads will take us to our next town, the town of Balliol. Having arrived in Balliol, one thing that we continue to have to remember is that we're not yet in Belgium. We're still in France. This is once more French Flanders. The town sat behind the front at Ypres, closer to the front. Just to the east and northeast of it was the Messines Ridge. In between Balliol and the Messines Ridge was the high ground of the Flanders Hills. So the terrain here was a bit more rolling compared to flat northern France to the south and flat Flanders beyond. The town as such was therefore away from direct observation of the Germans. It could be seen from observation balloons in the far distance and of course from the air. It was within artillery range and it was bombarded, but up until 1918, like Hazebrouck, it wasn't seriously damaged. It came under attack from artillery and from the air, but it wasn't being levelled in the same way that Ypres was, for example, just up the road. Trains were an important part of Balliol's purpose, but it wasn't a main railhead and a main railway juncture in the same way that Hazebrouck was. Trains did come in to the town from Hazebrouck, for example, and troops were unloaded here. And as the war went on, thousands of men would have passed through via train and then marched up to the front line beyond over the Flanders Hills. Its key purpose really was threefold. A supply route, so a direct route for supplies to get to the front line, so equipment, ammunition, food and everything else that was needed to sustain the army in the front was brought from the coast via Hazebrouck up to places like Balliol, unloaded and then distributed further up the line. We've had a look at the way supplies worked through food in the Great War in a previous podcast episode. Its second main purpose was as a rest area, being sheltered by those Flanders Hills away from the direct observation of the enemy. It meant that troops could come out of the line and come into Balliol as a place of rest when they were given a few days off before going up to repeat their frontline service all over again. So it became a place where soldiers could come to get away from the war. I mean, there was no escaping the war here, just as in Hazebrouck, where the streets would have been full of khaki. That would have been exactly the same here as Balliol. And the French population were here, so they too opened up all the facilities that were readily available for troops to come to and for the French people to earn money from those facilities, whether that be estaminets and bars and places where they could get photographs taken, or shops where they could buy things and plenty of other things besides. And it was also, its third purpose was as a training area, because around Balliol there were training areas that soldiers would come to learn about specific tasks, specific duties and on specific weaponry. So as the war went on, the army became more and more proficiently trained in signalling, in bayonet practice, in machine guns, in cooperation with aircraft and artillery and all the other things, and training grounds were set up in places like this for the men to come to learn these things. But while Hazebrouck was a frontier town, as we've described it, you could say that Balliol was a more vibrant town. Soldiers spent a lot more time here than they did at Hazebrouck. They were just passing through that town. Here they were coming for periods of rest and longer periods within the town itself. So with the shops and places to have your photograph taken, and most importantly the estaminets, this was a place that they remembered with fondness, really, because it was a place that they had some time away from the conflict, away from the frontline area. But like Hazebrouck, the war eventually caught up with Balliol. In April 1918, the German offensive swept over the Messines Ridge, and all the ground that had been taken in the offensives of 1917 was retaken by the Germans, and they pushed beyond. Places that had been behind the lines in Ypres, behind the lines in front of Messines, were captured in the fighting there, and gradually the German forces encroached on Balliol itself, came up over those Flanders hills, and in April 1918 the town was lost. The British 25th Division, who'd fought at different points on the Western Front, from Vimy to the Somme to the fighting at Passchendaele in 1917, were brought here, and they stopped the Germans on the western side of Balliol itself. Their divisional memorial is located in the town on a little roundabout. There's a column there with the details of the division commemorating its actions here in 1918, but the whole war as well. And they published a very good divisional history, a small-sized book with a lot of detail about what the division did from Vimy to the end of the war. And we've often said the connection between an old comrades association, the publication of a divisional history, and then the erection of a memorial like this, it is all connected. There's no doubt about that. But the fighting in 1918 put Balliol very much on the front line. The French civilian population was evacuated. All those people who had been very much part of that vibrant town that the British Tommy had been involved in during his rest periods away from the front, they left the town, fled west towards the coast, and Balliol became occupied by the Germans and was under continuous bombardment for the rest of that spring and into the summer of 1918. And it meant that by the end of the war, it too was part of the Zone Rouge, probably more damaged than Hazebrouck because it had sat on the very front line for several months and been bombarded by effectively both sides as a consequence of this. So what we see of Balliol today, it looks just like Ypres. It's risen like a phoenix from the ashes. It is a restored town, rebuilt in the 1920s, reflecting some of its past glory, but it is a location where we can come to, and it looks as if it's been here for centuries, but in fact most of the buildings date from the 1920s or later. Just outside the town is the Balliol Communal Cemetery and Extension. These are in fact two cemeteries, the Communal Cemetery and the later extension built by the British forces who were here for most of the rest of the war. The original one is largely a 1914 old contemptible cemetery in many respects, because with the fighting just down the road as the Germans tried to push towards the Channel coast, units who lost men there brought men back for burial here. There's an area of the cemetery where you can see collective graves, communal graves, where men are buried, I think, effectively in trenches, side by side, and there are multiple names on the headstones. In that plot as well is an original headstone, a different type of stone, a grey stone, commemorating officer of the Argyll and Southern Highlanders who was killed in the 1914 battles, and that was typical of the type of officers' memorials that went up during the war itself. That one should have been replaced by a commission headstone, but as with so many exceptions in so many cemeteries, it wasn't, and it's still there to this day. And then you move into the main plot of graves, the big organised long rows of graves that there are here at Balliol Communal Cemetery Extension, and we see a much more organised plot. And again, I think trenches were used here, as was not uncommon in hospital cemeteries, and that's effectively what this is, because Balliol was a reception area for casualties coming back from the fighting around Ypres. And what they did was dig long trenches when they knew that an offensive was coming, and as the wounded came in and sadly men died of their wounds, those trenches were filled by the bodies of the soldiers who died in the medical facilities. In the original communal cemetery there's just over 600 graves, but in the extension there's over 4,400 graves. So this is quite a sizable cemetery from the Great War. Now, it is a cemetery that deserves its own podcast, and we are going to come back here in the future to visit this cemetery and discuss it in greater detail and look at some of the characters who are buried here. But it is one of those cemeteries that you can come to, given its size, and seeing the rows of graves almost disappearing off into infinity across the cemetery. It gives you a sense of the scale of the First World War. And it's a good cemetery, a cross-section cemetery, as I often describe them, that covers the British Army from its lowest ranks to its highest. So there are thousands of ordinary soldiers buried here, but there are senior officers as well, somewhat dismissing that idea that generals die in bed. And it reflects as well, very importantly, casualties from the Battle of Messines in June of 1917. When the Battle of Messines was planned, and it was one of the most planned and detailed planned operations of the British Army during the trench warfare period on the Western Front, part of its planning involved the evacuation of and treatment of the wounded, and a route from the frontline areas back to the advanced dressing stations and then beyond to the casualty clearing stations here was well planned to bring the wounded back here for treatment. So all around Balliol, tucked up against those Flanders hills, was CCS, casualty clearing stations, and the men having been wounded in the attack on Messines Ridge, or having reached the far side of the ridge to defend the ground against German counterattacks and were wounded there, were brought back for treatment here, and sadly some of them died their wounds, and that's reflected in the burials that are in here as well. So although this is in France and many people will visit the Messines battlefields, this is an important Messines cemetery in terms of the story of what happened in that part of Flanders in June of 1917. And this is something we need to consider really when we go beyond the front to understand the wider aspects of where men were sent to when they were wounded in these battles that we're researching. In April 1918, the fighting literally came over the hills that you can see from the far side of the cemetery, and the whole town, as we mentioned, became part of the front line. The cemetery appears to have been damaged during that period, but not deliberately targeted by either side. The medical facilities were evacuated, the personnel, including the nurses that would have been here, were taken further behind the lines. But the cemetery remained, and there was no permanent damage to it in terms of the burials. The Germans buried some of their dead here, and there is a German plot in the cemetery. And if you're curious to know where the casualty clearing stations were located, if you drive past the cemetery and go away from the town, you come out into some open fields there, and you're coming into the ground where some of the CCS were located at different points during the war. I have a friend who lives close to Balliol who's a battlefield archaeologist who's taken part in some of the digs in that area, Manu Brill, and he works on several digs on the casualty clearing station sites here, excavating the rubbish pits from those casualty clearing stations, because soldiers would come in wounded from the battlefield, their equipment would have to be taken off or cut off and then was thrown away, their uniforms would often have to be cut off and disposed of, and they would have burners where they could put all this into and it would be disposed of as waste, and it would burn all the material, the webbing, the uniforms, things like that, but not the metal, and this would all be cleared out amongst the ashes and thrown into a rubbish tip. And there was a separate rubbish tip for all the medical waste as well. And Manu dug on this with his team, and they found an awful lot of insignia and buttons and all sorts of other personal items that had been burnt or attempted to be burned within the burners but had survived that. And that gave a clue to the regiments and the units that would have passed through here in terms of the casualties coming back from the front. But in the medical waste pits, they found examples of equipment that were being used by the medics, including things like blood transfusion kits, and these were pretty rare items, and Manu was able to give these, for example, to the Army Medical Services Museum in Aldershot, where I don't believe that they had an example of a First World War blood transfusion kit actually used on the battlefields. So it shows how important this type of archaeology is to give us an insight into what happens in places like a casualty clearing station, but an insight into the medical side of the war as well. Sadly, there is no war museum in Balliol, so none of this material is on display. Perhaps one day that will happen. Leaving the cemetery and taking the roads that take us up over those Flanders hills, we're going to cross places like the Mont de Cats. The Mont de Cats, one of the highest points in this area, is a hill not named after cats that meow. It's a derivation of an old French word meaning giants. This was the land of giants, these hills. And the Mont de Cats has a monastery on the top of it. On the slopes of the Mont de Cats there was a cavalry action in 1914, and the top of the hill was used as a billeting area. There was a signal school in the monastery that was here, and then that will take us up over the grounds towards Belgium and the border itself. But before we get there, we reach our final French location, and that is the village of Goedevaarsvelde. The village of Goedevaarsvelde, or Goddersveld as I've also heard it pronounced, was just as difficult for the Tommies of 1418 to pronounce as for us to pronounce it today. So they called it a number of different things. God wears velvet, or Gertie wears velvet is another version of that. These names, so difficult to pronounce for these men who'd often not been outside of their own towns, were always corrupted one way or another, and we know some of the polite versions of the corruptions, but I'm sure there's a book in some of the impolite ones as well. This little village on the border between France and Belgium was another route up towards the frontline area, but also an area where casualty clearing stations were located, particularly in the last phase of the war. Again, just as with Messines in 1917, in June of 1917, when the medical facilities were planned for the reception of wounded coming back from the front there, the same was true with the Third Battle of Ypres, the Battle of Passchendaele as we often call it, with troops coming back from the fighting northeast and east of Ypres. In the battles for the ridges there, they were brought back through a system of medical facilities for treatment in casualty clearing stations in a wide area. This was one of them. So where we are, we're still not in Belgium, but we're on a main route of evacuation for the wounded, and we're going to go to the outskirts of the town to where the British cemetery is located. Burials were started here in July of 1917 because the medical facilities that were placed around this village were specifically put in place to supplement those nearer to Poppering or up the road to receive those wounded that were expected to be coming back from the operations around Ypres itself. And it was used by 37th and 41st casualty clearing stations who operated here during that third Ypres period. And it's quite a big cemetery considering that, in terms of there's 894 British burials, 65 Australian, 5 Canadian, 2 New Zealand, 2 South African, 1 Indian and 19 Germans. Now, when you look at the cross section of burials that are here, it reflects the wounded coming back from the early phase of Third Ypres with the fighting on the Pilkelm Ridge and the Frasenberg Ridge, and then with the Australians, men wounded in the fighting around Polygon Wood and up towards the Brunseinder Ridge, and the couple of New Zealanders are here are from the fighting from that period as well. But there's a grave here that doesn't get many visitors compared to a similar grave just a few miles up the road that perhaps should. Now, each year, thousands of people in pre-COVID times would visit Lissenhurst Cemetery. We've done a podcast on that cemetery ourselves here on the Old Front Line. It's an important cemetery. It was once one of the biggest British cemeteries from the First World War when the war ended. But in there is the grave of a nurse, Nellie Spindler, and many British school children who come on school battlefield tours go to visit her grave, believing in some cases that she is the only nurse to be killed in Flanders during the First World War. But here in this cemetery is another, Sister Elsie Margaret Kemp. She was part of the Territorial Force Nursing Service, and she was killed in a bombing raid on the 37th Casualty Clearing Station on the 20th of October 1917. She was born in 1881 in Wellington, New Zealand, and her father was a surgeon. In 1904 she trained as a nurse at King's College Hospital and graduated in February 1908. She worked as a surgical nurse, trying, I would guess, as much as she could as a woman at that time to follow in her father's footsteps. Professional nurses like her were in great demand when the war broke out in 1914, and she joined up at the beginning of the war in the Territorial Force Nursing Service and went across to France in January of 1916. So she was present at battles like the Somme, later in the fighting around Arras, and then up here for the Third Battle of Ypres and probably Messines as well. So her experience as a nurse had cut across that period of the war in which the war had become more and more industrialised, the killing had become industrialised, and the kind of wounds that soldiers were receiving, from shrapnel wounds to bullet wounds to gas, it also reflected the changing nature of warfare as well, and she'd seen all of that. Her death reflects how casualty clearing stations had become targets themselves because they were very close to camps, to training areas, to supply depots, and the Germans weren't targeting medical facilities, but there were no smart bombs, and there was no way to drop a bomb specifically on a target accurately in terms of missing one target against another. And that's how this area came to be bombed in October 1917, most likely from German Gotha bombers that were being used to fly over from their bases behind the lines in Flanders to target areas like this behind the British lines. Elsie Kemp was the only New Zealand nurse to be killed on the Western Front during the Great War, and although she's buried here in France and died on French soil, her story is as much connected to Flanders as Nellie Spindler. Nellie Spindler being buried across the border is the one that understandably many visitors gravitate towards because it's easy to get to, it's easy to find out information. And this cemetery here at Goddersveld, Gertie wears velvet, God wears velvet, whatever we're going to call it, is out in the sticks. It's difficult to find and away from the main tourist route, the travel route across the Great War battlefields. But nevertheless, it's an important grave to visit. There are only 2 women from British and Commonwealth forces buried on Belgian soil, Nellie Spindler at Lissenherk and another nurse who died of influenza who's buried in Brussels. But Elsie Kemp, the New Zealand nurse buried here, is just as much part of that wider story. And again, it shows how important it is to consider not just the ground where a battle was fought, but the wider ground beyond it, and the repercussions often across what are national borders that really at the time of the war meant very little. The men who served here in this village and the medical personnel in the casualty clearing station probably thought they were in Belgium when they were here. They made no real discrimination between this part of the landscape and another. It was all, I would guess, as one veteran said to me, foreign. Leaving Godevarsvelde, we'll head out across the landscape and we'll make our journey finally into Belgium itself. Our first village we come to as we take this route is the village of Ypres, and we see our first British cemetery out in the fields, Ypres Aerodrome Cemetery. That was a site where the Royal Flying Corps had an aerodrome, an airbase, to fly from here up over the battlefields around Ypres. And one of the pilots who flew from here in 1917 was William Robinson Clark. We discussed him in the episode on black soldiers in the British Army during the Great War for this podcast. He was one of the very first black pilots in the Royal Flying Corps in the Great War, a Jamaican who paid for his own passage across to Britain, served as ground crew in the RFC, and eventually rose to become sergeant pilot and fly in combat until his aircraft was hit and he crashed and damaged his back and could no longer fly in active service. And he was one of many pilots from many squadrons that flew from Ypres during the Great War. There was also an American cemetery here. In 1918, with the American Expeditionary Force taking part in the fighting around Flanders, 27th New York and the 30th Tennessee Divisions in particular were involved in those battles. They buried their dead in a number of different locations, including here at Ypres. And there's a really good memoir called Over There with Orion's Roughnecks by a soldier who served in a machine gun unit in one of those American divisions. And he came back to these battlefields in the 1950s after the Second World War and came to Ypres because he knew they'd buried their comrades there in 1918. There was no sign of the graves, and he thought that in the recent war, the war against Nazi Germany, that they'd removed those American graves, perhaps destroyed them. But in fact what had happened is that many had been repatriated back to the United States or taken to the in Flanders Field Cemetery at Waregem, and that's where they're buried. So again, there are often missing elements on the landscape connecting us to other armed forces, and the existence of an American cemetery here in 1918 is a good example of that. The main road beyond Ypres takes a big curve at one point and then goes dead straight as it heads towards Popperinge. We're now firmly on Belgian soil, and this road now runs on the site of the old railway line because the railway route from Hazebrouck brought troops coming up to Flanders directly across the border here and up to Popperinge itself, and in the early phase of the war directly up to Ypres before the Germans captured all the high ground and could see into Ypres itself. That railway line was torn up in the 1960s, and I would guess that for a long time the railway line was just abandoned, but sometime in the 70s, 80s this was turned into a main road and takes us on a direct route to Popperinge itself. A little bit further up on the right we can see the tall trees that line the edge of Lissenherk Cemetery, and we can see the original farm buildings of the Remy siding, which was the little farm around the area where a railhead was tapped off of this main railway line and hospital trains could pull in there to pick up the wounded to take them further down the medical evacuation route. The main casualty clearing stations operated here at Remy Siding and what became Lissenherk, and a cemetery grew as a consequence of this, becoming one of the largest British cemeteries that existed at the end of the First World War, with over 10,000 graves, later eclipsed by the creation of Tyne-Cot Cemetery close to Passchendaele. We're not going to go into Lissenherk as part of this visit. We've covered that in some detail in a previous podcast, and you can refer yourself back to that. We're going to continue along the road. As we come into the outskirts of Popperinge, as the war progressed and the Germans bombarded Popperinge railway station on a more regular basis, another little railhead was made here for the soldiers to get out. It was called the Hop Out. This is where they hopped out of the trains and then went on foot, or if they were lucky, in the back of an old Bill bus or a lorry to go up to the front line area. But we'll follow the road around and into the town of Popperinge, coming out into the main square here. Popperinge, or Pops as the troops called it, was really the main town behind Ypres in terms of the British and Commonwealth forces during the Great War. It was originally part of the French sector in 1914-15 when the French army had held a good chunk of the ground around Ypres itself, and the French had used it as their forward base depot, if you like, for troops on the battlefield there. And when the French pulled out and the British extended their front around Ypres, they took over Popperinge in 1915. Now again, we're going to return to Popperinge for a proper look at it in a future podcast, hopefully walking around the ground itself and recording it on site. But in terms of its position in what we've looked at, we've had said it was called A Tale of Three Towns, this podcast. This is the third town, and with that third town we are finally on Belgian soil. So we've come from Hazebrouck to Balliol, Balliol to Popperinge. And Popperinge, much nearer the front, was again used in different kinds of ways to the others. It was used for billeting, so in the early period of the war, troops were billeted amongst the civilian occupation with size 10 boots, broke things, stole things, or shall we say lifted things, and it caused a lot of friction between the troops and the population itself. There's a town major war diary that exists for the town major of Popperinge. Not all of those, sadly, not all of those town major war diaries survive, but it gives us a bit of an insight into the experience between the local population and British soldiers when you see the number of civilians coming forward to claim that this had been stolen, that had been damaged, and asking for compensation. And mostly the British just paid it without any kind of question at all. But it was realised that as the size of the army grew, it wasn't really practical to try and billet all of the army within the town itself. So a series of satellite camps were built around Popperinge, tents and then huts and then Nissen huts as they were developed later on in the conflict. So it became almost like a permanent British base just behind the lines at Ypres, with the front lines being 10-12 miles away at different points. The civilian population stayed in Popperinge throughout the First World War, and again, like the other towns, they supplied whatever the British soldier needed when he was out on rest and coming into this town for a bit of rest and recuperation. And that would once more be estaminets and cafes, places where you could get food and drink. There'd often be a piano in the corner and they could play the piano, or someone was already playing the piano. And this would be part of soldiers' culture. It would be a place in which soldiers would also encounter young women. And whenever you have soldiers, young men with money in their pockets and an uncertain future, that will, if we're speaking honestly, create a situation in which prostitution can be rife. And that was just as much part of the experience of the Great War in Popperinge as cafes and photographic studios and shops and all the other things. That's one end of the scale. Another is the officers' club, Skindles, that was set up specifically for officers when they were on local leave or out of the trenches themselves. But right at the other end of the scale, of course, away from what was going on in some of the backstreet bars in Popperinge, is Talbot House. Just off the main square, a Belgian townhouse with a big hop loft had been taken over in 1915 by two army chaplains, the Reverend Neville Talbot and the Reverend PSB Tubby Clayton. They desired to set up a place for soldiers to come to when they were out of the line, a place of safety, a place of sanctuary that wasn't overtly religious. They thought perhaps of calling it church house originally, but that was obviously too overtly religious, and instead they named it Talbot House, not after Neville Talbot himself, but his brother Gilbert Talbot, who'd been killed with the Rifle Brigade at Hoog in 1915. And this was a place soldiers could come to forget about the war, really. There was a quiet room, there was a place they could write letters and be given paper and a pencil or pen to write those letters and then send them through the Army Postal Service at no cost to themselves back home. There was a library, there was a cellar where they could see Charlie Chaplin films, there was a concert hall eventually out the back, and up in the hop loft they turned that into a chapel, and thousands of soldiers climbed the stairs and up that final part of the rickety ladder up into the loft to attend those religious services during the Great War, many of them of course on a one-way ticket to the front line. It became such an important part of the soldiers' experience here in Popperinga. Countless thousands came here during the Great War, and it meant so much to them, so much that when the war was over and the pilgrimages began in the post-war period in the 20s, men would often come and knock on the door of this house, the old house as they called it, and it reverted to being a civilian residence. And the family perhaps were not too keen to have old soldiers knocking on the door and saying, "Can I come in and see Talbot House?" So eventually the house was bought for the TOC H organisation by Lord Wakefield, who'd made his money from Castrol Oil, and the house in some respects reverted to partially the status that it had during the war. This place that people could come to, in this case now in the post-war period, to not forget about a war, but to become a beacon of remembrance, a place that pilgrims could come to as part of their travels round these battlefields where so many of the former parishioners of Talbot House were now laid to rest in the cemetery of the silent cities of Flanders fields. And that continues to this day. When I first used to go across to the battlefields in the 80s, I stayed at Talbot House. You can still stay there now. There are rooms to rent on a self-catering basis. It's a great place to go to. It's a building that lives, that breathes history, and it's a real privilege to be able to stay there. And as well, it is also a museum. You can visit the Museum of Life Behind the Lines there. You can go on a tour through the house. You can have a cup of tea there, and you can go up into the Hop Loft Chapel as well. And when I take leisure groups there, as we often do, it's quite nice just to go up there when they're having a tour of the lower part of the house, to go up there on your own and sit for a few minutes in quiet in the chapel and connect with all those voices, all those marching feet that came through the town and up those steps and sat there in quiet solitude like yourself all those years before. It's a truly magical place, Talbot House, and thoroughly recommended that you visit that at some point, but more of that in another podcast. Popperinga, forever the town of contrasts. When we move away from Talbot House and go back into the main square, we can see the town hall in front of us. And if we go round the back of the town hall through an archway, we come into what's called the death cells. And these were pre-war police cells used by the military authorities to detain largely drunken soldiers found wandering around the streets of Popperinga, but also to detain men who were deserters who would go on to be executed. And quite a number of soldiers were executed in Popperinga during the Great War, and in the square behind, several of them. We don't know exactly how many. The records are not always specific about exact location, but certainly not an inconsiderable number were executed here in this little courtyard behind the town hall. And there is a Shot at Dawn memorial there now commemorating this. When I first came here in the 80s with my old friend Julian Sykes, who was one of the co-authors for the book Shot at Dawn, we discovered that one of the original execution posts was stored in the local town museum, which we then went and fetched out and photographed, and that was on display here for quite some time, but it degraded being outside, so it's been put back into storage again. A rather grim souvenir, grim relic of what took place here during the Great War. Leaving the central square area, we take the road, the Ypres road, that takes you out of Popperinga up towards Ypres itself, and we come to the railway station. And I often come here and stand on the platform because for a big chunk of the war, soldiers came through Popperinga en route to the front, and this is where they disembarked from trains to march up the old cobbled road that took them ever forward towards those front lines. The railway station is used today by the local people to go into Ypres and beyond to other parts of Belgium. It's quite a busy station whenever I've been here, but I think of it with the sound of boots on the platform, and I have photographs in an album I have from an officer of the Army Service Corps who was here in 1914 and 15 of French soldiers getting out of trains and marching up to the front line. But for most British soldiers, this is where their real war, if this was their first time up towards the front, this is where their war began. Popperinga was clearly a military town. There were soldiers everywhere. In the distance was this deep thunder, this rumble of the artillery, the constant sound of the battlefields. Even when there was no major activity going on, the sound of the guns was as constant as the rain, as the sun, as the wind and the clouds. As they left the small square in front of the railway station, and their boots began to echo across the cobbles of the old road that led from Popperinga ever onwards to Ypres, each step took them nearer to the front line. Passing them, coming back, were the haggard faces of those who had just returned, the smiling, optimistic faces of the new arrivals compared to those who had seen the war, had experienced the war. This was the point in which those two worlds merged for the individual soldier, and where his life really would never be the same again. In the 20s, the road took on a different meaning. Pilgrims came to Popperinga, and they too took this road, not to a battle, not to a trench in Flanders fields, but perhaps to a silent city, to remember a face in a fading photograph, to recall a connection with a father, a brother, a husband or a son. And more than a century later, those pilgrims still take this road to connect, to understand, and to visit the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.